She thought he meant to kill her. The thought was singular, clear, and sharp as a knife, piercing the chaotic fog in Mara's mind as her slender back slammed against the baked red clay of Devil's Canyon. The vast New Mexico sky was gone, blotted out entirely by the colossal shadow of the man pinning her to the earth. Heat radiated from the ground in waves, breathing against her neck like a starving beast. But it was the ice in her veins that paralyzed her. She struggled, kicking her bare feet wildly at the air, her fingers clawing at the arid dirt, in a desperate search for leverage to shove him off. It was useless. He was as heavy as a mountain boulder, a dead weight that refused to shift. Mara wanted to scream. She wanted to rend the dead silence of the canyon, to beg for help from anyone or anything hiding within those sheer red cliffs. But her throat produced only choked, guttural sounds, gasps, helpless and broken. Her voice had died long ago, on the same day as her father, leaving her in a silent world where the only scream she could muster was through wide, terror-filled eyes. And those eyes were now locked onto the face of Elias Thorne. This was not the face of the weathered, quiet farmer she had met 2 days ago. This was the face of a wounded animal gone mad. Sweat, streaked with red dust, carved winding paths through his sunburned skin, pooling in a matted grey beard. His eyes, webbed with bloodshot veins, were not looking at hers. They were fixated on Mara's right thigh, where her old cotton dress had been violently torn open, exposing a cruel truth Mara dared not look down to see. "Lie still," Elias roared. It didn't sound human. The voice was fractured, hoarse as gravel grinding together at the bottom of a ravine. "You move, and you're dead." Mara didn't hear the warning. She only felt his hand, calloused and rough as ancient tree bark, clamping down on her wound with a grip so tight she thought her femur would snap. The pain didn't hit instantly. It arrived slowly, freezing cold at first before detonating into a firestorm that scorched every nerve ending. Blood. The metallic stench of it assaulted Mara's nose, overpowering the smell of dust and dry sage. Hot, sticky blood was gushing through Elias's fingers, soaking his sleeves, turning the earth beneath them black. It was her blood. Too much of it. Far too much for a body this small. Her life was draining away, slipping out like sand through open fingers. Elias Thorne knew it. He could feel the pulse fluttering weakly beneath his palm, fading fast. For a split second, reality blurred before the old combat medic's eyes. The red rock canyon vanished, replaced by a field tent reeking of gunpowder and gangrene 30 years in the past, or worse, the dark bedroom, where his own little girl had breathed her last. Taken by a malignant fever, his hands were too helpless to cure. Elias's right hand began to shake. Was it the familiar tremor of an alcoholic deprived of his drink, or the tremble of a doctor who had lost faith in his own hands? He didn't know. He only knew that if he let go now, this girl would die. This girl with Sarah's eyes would die. "No," Elias muttered, teeth grinding together loud enough to hear. "Not allowed. Not this time." He released one hand, keeping the other jammed hard against Mara's femoral artery. With a jerky, violent motion, he fished a large-caliber rifle cartridge from his tattered leather coat. Without hesitation, he clamped the bullet between his teeth, wrenched the copper casing away, and spat the lead slug onto the ground. Mara's eyes went wide. In her blind panic, she saw him loading a round. She thought he was preparing a mercy kill to keep her from the enemy. Terror surged, granting her one last, desperate burst of strength. She drove her remaining heel hard into Elias's chest. The kick wasn't enough to throw him off, but it was enough to enrage him. He lunged forward, using his full body weight to pin her legs to the dirt. "I said lie still," he screamed in her face, his breath heavy with cheap tobacco. But then his voice cracked, becoming strangely distorted and tremulous. "Stay here, don't go, Sarah. No, Mara, please, stay with me." Mara froze. Sarah? That wasn't her name. The savage glare in the man's eyes suddenly turned wet and wild, holding a depth of agony that stalled Mara's fear for a heartbeat. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking through her, at a ghost from his past. But Elias had no time to bargain with ghosts. He upended the brass casing. The deadly black powder, raw gunpowder, rained down into the gaping, jagged wound on Mara's thigh. The powder mixed with the fresh blood, forming a gruesome black paste. Mara looked down, and for the first time, she understood what he was about to do. No, impossible. She shook her head violently, tears streaming down to mix with the grime on her cheeks. She tried to open her mouth to beg, to scream, "Don't!" But the only sound was the wind hissing through her teeth. Elias pulled a crushed matchbox from his breast pocket. His hands were shaking so badly he dropped the first match. "Damn it!" he cursed, the sound like a sob. The second match snapped in half. The blood was still flowing. Mara's face had turned the color of wax. Her lips were blue. All right, Elias whispered, reassuring himself. Or the girl, or God. He struck the third match against the sole of his boot. Scritch! A small yellow flame flickered into life amidst the windy canyon. It was fragile, but in Mara's eyes, it was the most terrifying thing on earth. Elias didn't wait. He didn't count to 3. He offered no apology. He knew that hesitation was the Reaper's scythe. He dropped the burning match into the gunpowder-soaked wound. In that moment, time stopped. The powder caught. It didn't just burn, it flashed. A controlled explosion right on top of the raw flesh. A ferocious heat erupted in an instant, melting vessels, searing nerve endings, and cauterizing the flow of blood with the fires of hell. Mara's body arched off the ground like a bow drawn to its breaking point. There was no scream. The pain was beyond anything the human voice could articulate. It was a bolt of white lightning striking straight into her spinal cord, erasing all consciousness, all sensation, leaving only the blinding white of absolute agony. Her eyes rolled back into her head, mouth agape in a silent howl that tore at the soul of the man watching her. The smell of burnt flesh rose up, mingling with acrid sulfur. The scent of war, the scent of life, snatched back from the hands of death. Elias tossed the matchbox aside and slammed both bare hands, ignoring the residual heat, down onto the charred, blackened wound. He gritted his teeth against the burn, pressing down, pressing harder. "Breathe," he commanded, tears cutting tracks through his wrinkled cheeks, falling onto Mara's face. "Breathe, girl. Don't you die. Daddy forbids you to die." Mara slumped. Her body went limp, collapsing back onto the dusty earth. Her chest rose and fell faintly, a ragged rhythm like a candle flickering in the wind. But it was there. The blood had stopped. The wound was now a grotesque char-soured crust, ugly, brutal, but dry. Elias collapsed beside her, heaving for air like a steam engine about to burst. He looked at his own hands, stained with blood and soot. They were still trembling, but not from fear anymore, from exhaustion and relief. He had done it. He had committed the cruelest act to save the most precious thing. Silence returned to Devil's Canyon. Only the wind whistled through the vertical cliffs like walls imprisoning lost souls, but the false peace didn't last 3 breaths. Elias raised his head. The old, worn-out ears of a veteran had caught the sound he feared most. Distant, faint, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Not one horse. A pack. They were coming. The wolves were coming. And he, an old dog with no fangs left, was guarding a dying lamb in the middle of the wasteland. Elias Thorne wiped his bloody hands on his trousers, his eyes turning cold and sharp once more. He reached for the revolver lying in the dust and checked the cylinder. 3 rounds left. He looked down at the unconscious Mara, gently brushing the matted, sweat-soaked hair from her forehead. The gesture was so tender it stood in stark contrast to the brutality of moments before. "Rest easy, kid," he whispered, his voice raspy but steady as bedrock. "It's my turn to bleed." The stench of burnt flesh hadn't faded. It hung heavy in the still air of the canyon, thick and clinging to the nasal passages, a brutal reminder of what had just transpired. Elias sat with his back against the cold stone, the revolver resting loosely in his lap. His breathing had evened out, but his hands were still trembling, not from adrenaline this time, but from the thirst. His body, pickled in cheap whiskey for the better part of a decade, was screaming for alcohol to soothe nerves that were pulled as tight as piano wire. He reached for the flask at his hip. Empty. A twisted, dry grin cracked his lips. "Fine. If you want to shoot straight, you can't be drunk." Elias's gaze drifted from the red dust horizon, sliding down to the small, motionless figure lying beside him. Mara hadn't woken up. The shock of the gunpowder burn had dragged her into a deep slumber, a place where, Elias hoped, no pain could reach her. He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since this mad dash for survival began. Beneath the grime and dried blood on her face, he saw features that were heartbreakingly familiar. The stubborn, high bridge of the nose, the broad forehead. Those weren't Mara's traits. They were Liam's. "Your daddy," Elias whispered into the void, his voice raspy. "Your daddy was a fool, Mara. A fool who believed in justice in a land where the law is written in lead." The memories rushed back, sharp as shards of broken glass cutting into his mind. 3 days ago, Liam O'Neill, the only friend who would still look the drunkard, Elias Thorne, in the eye, had been hanged from the old oak in the town square. No court, no jury, just Harlan, the wolf, Kincaid, and a death sentence stamped by greed. They said Liam stole horses. A blatant lie. Everyone knew, but no one dared whisper against. Liam hadn't stolen horses. Liam had found silver, a massive vein running deep beneath the barren soil of the O'Neill Ranch, something Kincaid had coveted for years. That night, the rain had come down in sheets. Elias was passed out over an empty bottle when the tent flap was nearly torn off. When he opened it, Mara was standing there, soaked, shivering, silent, her eyes, mute since the carriage accident years ago, held a terror that no words could describe. She wasn't holding clothes or money. She was clutching a thick, leather-bound ledger against her chest. The book recorded every dirty deal, every bribe, every name erased by Kincaid's hand, evidence her father had secretly gathered for 2 years. Liam had died protecting that book. And now, Mara was placing her life in the hands of a doctor whose soul had long since withered away. Elias dragged a hand down his face, rough fingers scraping against stubble. He remembered the moment Mara handed him the ledger. She couldn't say, "Save me," but the way she gripped his filthy sleeve, the way she looked at him as if he were the last piece of driftwood in a black ocean. It had awakened something that had been dormant in him for a decade. "I intended to turn you away," Elias confessed to the comatose girl. "I was going to slam the door, drink myself into oblivion, and forget everything by morning. I'm a coward, Mara. I've been a coward for 10 years. He leaned forward, adjusting the tattered coat draped over her. His hand hovered over the charred black wound on her thigh. Why had he opened the door? Why had he dragged that old iron from under the bed? Why was he sitting here in this godforsaken Devil's Canyon, waiting for death to come calling? Not for Liam. Friendship was a luxury, but not enough to make a drunkard throw his life away. It was for Sarah. The image of his own little girl rose up, as clear as if she was standing before him. Sarah with her golden hair and bright smile. Sarah lying in a sickbed, burning up with a malignant fever. 10 years ago, Elias Thorne wasn't a drunken farmer. He was Dr. Thorne, the man with the golden hands who had saved hundreds of soldiers on the battlefield. But when his own daughter needed him most, he was powerless. No medicine, no supplies. A blizzard had isolated their home, cutting off all roads to town. He had sat there holding his daughter's hand, watching the life slowly fade from those innocent eyes. He was a doctor, yet he could do nothing but wipe the sweat from her brow and whisper lies that everything would be all right. When Sarah's heart stopped, a part of Elias died with her. He smashed his medicine cabinet, burned his degrees, and dove to the bottom of a bottle to escape the sound of Daddy echoing in his nightly nightmares. But 3 days ago, looking at Mara, standing in the rain, soaked and terrified, Elias didn't see Liam's daughter. He saw Sarah. He saw a chance to redeem the failure God hadn't allowed him to fix. He couldn't save Sarah from the fever, but he could save Mara from the wolves. "I'm sorry," Elias whispered, his voice cracking in his throat. A single hot tear, a rare thing, rolled down his sun-weathered cheek and landed on the back of Mara's hand. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I'm sorry I used fire, but I couldn't let you die, not on my watch, not this time." The whistling of the wind outside the canyon seemed to shift. It carried a different sound now, rhythmic and heavy. Hoofbeats. They were closer, clearer. The sound of iron shoes striking stone sounded like death, knocking at the door. Elias wiped the tear away, the weakness vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. He gripped the revolver, spinning the cylinder. 3 rounds, 3 chances, and he still had the dagger in his boot. He looked toward the mouth of the canyon, where the harsh sunlight sliced through, creating a blinding glare. Out there, the dust was beginning to rise. Harlan Kincaid was coming, the man who appointed himself the law, the man who thought money and bullets could buy silence. Elias stood up, shielding Mara with his long shadow. He wasn't shaking anymore. The hands of the surgeon returned, cold, steady, and precise. "Sleep, Mara," he said, his voice hardening like cooling steel. "When you wake up, either we'll be free, or we'll be seeing your daddy again." He narrowed his eyes, his index finger slowly curling around the trigger. "Come on then, wolves. Let's see whose teeth are sharper." Devil's Canyon never released those who stepped into its jaws. Elias Thorne realized this the moment he saw the vertical cliff face looming before him. It towered high, slick and crimson, like a giant scar slashing across the sky. The trail, if this gravel-choked fissure could even be called a trail, had ended. They had hit a dead end. Elias's old horse, a loyal beast coated in red dust, was foaming at the mouth. Its flanks heaved violently, front legs trembling as if ready to buckle. It had run beyond its limit, carrying the weight of 2 lives and a past full of sins. Elias slid off the saddle. His feet hit the ground, and he nearly collapsed as a sharp agony shot through his knee, a souvenir from the war. But he didn't have the right to fall. He turned to catch Mara. The young girl slid into his arms like an empty sack. She was impossibly light and burning up. The fever from trauma and blood loss was beginning to consume her. Mara's eyes were half open, glazed and vacant, staring into the void. She no longer knew where she was or who was holding her. "Hang in there, kid," Elias muttered, knowing how hollow the words sounded. "Just a little longer." He hoisted her up, limping toward a small alcove hidden behind a withered cactus. It wasn't a shelter. It was just a shallow grave for 2 wounded animals waiting for the hunter to finish them off. Laying Mara down on the cold stone, Elias turned to look back at the path they had just traveled. Dust. A massive cloud of it was churning up from the canyon mouth, less than a mile away. The sound of hoofbeats was no longer a distant echo. It had become a rhythm of death, clop, 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 bouncing off the canyon walls and amplified 1,000 times over. Harlan Kincaid didn't ride alone. Elias counted at least 5 riders through the haze, 5 professional gunmen against 1 old man with 3 bullets and a dying girl. The outcome was already decided. Elias knew it. He wasn't a hero from the dime novels sold at the general store. He was a man practical to the point of cruelty. They couldn't run. They couldn't win a shootout. So the goal now wasn't survival. The goal was victory. And for Elias Thorne, victory had only one definition. The truth had to survive. Elias's gaze fell to the leather satchel at Mara's hip. Inside lay the ledger, the thick black-bound book containing numbers and names sufficient to send Kincaid to the gallows 10 times over. He yanked the bag open and pulled the book out. The leather cover was tattered, soaked in sweat and the blood of Mara's father. "If they find this," Elias mumbled, his thumb brushing the cover, "they'll burn it, and then they'll kill the girl." Kincaid was an old wolf. He would search everything. He would slash open saddlebags, rip apart saddles, even strip their corpses to find this book. No rock crevice, no bush was safe. Elias looked around. Bare rock, dust, no hiding place. Then his eyes stopped on Mara. specifically on the charred black wound on her thigh. A crazy, brutal, genius idea flashed through his mind, an idea that only a combat surgeon, one who had once hidden soldiers' suicide notes inside necrotic wounds to smuggle them home, could conceive. "The most dangerous place," he whispered, eyes narrowing with calculation, "is the safest place." Time was running out. The hoofbeats had reached the final bend. Elias opened the ledger. He couldn't hide the whole book. It was too big. He frantically flipped through the yellowed pages, his eyes scanning the lines. May 12th, bribed Judge Miller, $500. June 4th, silver mine accident, 12 miners dead, intentional explosion. July 20th, hanging order for Liam O'Neill, no trial, there, 3 pages, the 3 most damning pages. The dark heart of Kincaid's empire lay right here. Rip! The sound of tearing paper was piercing in the silence of the alcove. Elias ripped the 3 pages out. He crumpled the rest of the book and hurled it into a deep, dark fissure in the cliff face, where the shadows swallowed it whole. He held the 3 fragile sheets, rolling them tighter, until the roll was no thicker than his pinky finger, but paper was fragile. Blood and bodily fluids would ruin the ink. He needed a casing. Elias looked at the ground. The brass cartridge, the empty shell he had used to burn the gunpowder in Chapter 1. It lay there, glinting under the harsh sun like an omen. He snatched it up, a .45 Colt casing, solid brass. He stuffed the rolled paper inside. It fit perfectly. He used a small rock to hammer the rim of the casing, crimping the metal shut to seal it. Now he had a bullet containing the truth, and he needed a chamber to load it into. Elias knelt beside Mara. The girl lay still, her breathing shallow. He pulled the dagger from his boot. The blade was dull and dusty. He wiped it on his trousers. "Forgive me, Mara," he said, his voice shaking, but his hands steady. "I'm about to hurt you one more time, but I swear, this is the last time." Elias undid the makeshift bandage he had tied earlier. The wound was exposed, a patch of charred, bumpy flesh shriveled by the heat of the gunpowder. Around the burn, the skin was swollen and angry red. Yellowish serum was weeping out. Kincaid was a monster, but he was a fastidious dandy. He loathed filth. He would search pockets, search boots, even pry open their mouths. But he would never want to touch a necrotic, charred, stinking wound. That was his blind spot. Elias placed the bullet of truth right in the center of the wound. He pressed down, deep into the burnt flesh. Mara let out an unconscious groan of agony. Her body jerked. Shh, shh. Elias pinned her leg with one hand, using the other to shove the bullet into place. It nestled deep within the crater of burnt meat, hidden by the blackened scab. But that wasn't enough. If she moved, it would fall out. He needed to secure it. Elias tore a long strip of cloth from his own filthy shirt. He didn't just wrap it around her thigh. He tied it with a field medic's knot, the kind used to secure splints on broken bones. He pulled it tight, mercilessly tight. The old fabric crushed down on the casing, driving it deeper into Mara's flesh. Blood seeped through the cloth, staining it red instantly. From the outside, it looked like nothing more than a clumsily bandaged, filthy, bleeding wound. No one would suspect that beneath the bloody rag and the charred meat lay the death sentence for the most powerful man in the territory. Done. Elias exhaled, wiping sweat from his brow with a bloody hand. He looked at Mara. She was carrying a secret that could kill her or save this entire town. She was a living treasure chest, and he was the lock. As long as he was alive, or as long as the attention was on him, Mara would be safe. They would think he hid the book somewhere along the road. They would torture him. They would kill him. And in the meantime, they would dismiss Mara as a useless hostage, a crippled, dirty girl not worth the effort. That was the plan. A shadow fell over the canyon. Not the shadow of night, but the shadow of the riders who had arrived. 5 men on horseback lined up, blocking the only exit. Long dusters, hat brims pulled low, and dark gun barrels pointed straight at the alcove. In the center was Harlan Kincaid. He sat atop a massive black stallion, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the wild surroundings. On his chest, a polished sheriff's star reflected the sun, blinding and fake. Kincaid didn't draw his gun. He didn't need to. He just sat there, looking down at Elias like a king, looking at a cockroach. "Elias Thorne," his voice boomed, deep and resonant like stones tumbling in a deep cave. "I thought a doctor would pick a cleaner place to die." Elias stood up. He positioned himself in front of Mara, completely blocking Kincaid's view of the girl. He didn't draw his gun. He raised both hands high, palms open, showing them empty. "Harlan," Elias replied, his voice strangely calm. "I picked my dying place 10 years ago. I just showed up today to check in." Kincaid laughed, a short, dry bark. He signaled for 2 henchmen to dismount. "Not bad. I always liked your humor." He tilted his head, wolfish eyes narrowing. "But I didn't come here for jokes. I came to reclaim my property. Give me the ledger, and I promise you a quick death, one in the head. Painless." Elias smirked, a smile full of defiance. He slowly lowered one hand, pointing a finger toward the deep fissure in the cliff behind him, where he had thrown the crumpled, gutted book. "You want the book?" Elias asked, his tone baiting. "It's in hell. I sent it ahead to save a seat for you." Kincaid's smile vanished. His face hardened, cold and cruel. "Search him," he ordered abruptly. "Search everything. If you don't find the book, skin the old man alive." 2 bounty hunters stepped forward, guns drawn. Their boots crunched on the gravel. Crunch, crunch. Elias stood rooted like a tree. His heart hammered against his ribs, but not from fear of death. He was counting every shallow breath Mara took behind him. "Look at me," Elias screamed in his mind, forcing the wolf pack's attention solely on himself. "Look at me. Beat me. Kill me. Just don't look down at her leg. Don't look at the wound." The trap was sprung, and the bait was Elias. The pistol whip cracked across Elias's face with the force of a sledgehammer. The world before him exploded into 1,000 shards of white light, spinning in chaotic vertigo. He slammed onto the gravel, the copper taste of fresh blood flooding his mouth, salty and warm. Pain radiated from his cheekbone, sharp and blinding. But Elias didn't make a sound. He clenched his jaw, swallowing the groan back down his throat. "Find anything?" Harlan Kincaid's voice cut through the fog in Elias's skull, cold and impatient. "Nothing, sir," a mercenary shouted back, his voice lost amidst the sounds of rough ransacking. He was upending Elias's saddlebag, dumping everything onto the dirt. Dirty bandages, an empty bottle, a few sticks of rock-hard jerky scattered everywhere. "Just trash." Kincaid stepped forward. His polished leather boots stopped inches from Elias's face. He looked down, not with explosive anger, but with the disdain of a man who never had to dirty his own fingernails. He nudged Elias's ribs with the toe of his boot, like he was checking roadkill. "What did you do with it, Elias?" Kincaid asked, his voice dropping to a register as dangerous as the rattle of a snake. "I know Liam gave it to the girl, and I know you aren't stupid enough to throw your only insurance policy off a cliff." Elias pushed himself up to a sitting position and spat a mouthful of blood at Kincaid's feet. He looked up, his eyes swollen, but the gaze within was sharp and unyielding. He didn't look at Kincaid the way a victim looks at an executioner. He looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a malignant tumor that needs to be cut out. "I told you," Elias wheezed, every word dragging pain through his chest. "I burned it, used it to start a fire last night. You know, paper burns real nice." Kincaid narrowed his eyes. He didn't believe it. Of course he didn't. He turned his back, walking toward Mara, who lay motionless in the alcove. Elias's heart skipped a beat. He wanted to lunge, to shield her, but two soldiers were on him instantly, pinning his shoulders to the dirt. He could only watch helplessly as Kincaid loomed over the young girl. Mara was still comatose. Her face was pale as wax, beaded with cold sweat, yet her lips were cracked and dry from fever. The bandage on her thigh was soaked in fresh blood. Blood from the old wound, and blood from the fresh incision Elias had made to hide the casing. From a distance it looked pathetic, filthy. Kincaid stooped down, using two gloved fingers to pinch Mara's chin, turning her face side to side. He clicked his tongue. "Tisk, tisk," he said, his tone so fake it made Elias's stomach churn. "Poor girl, look what you did to her, Elias." He straightened up, turning to address his mercenaries, projecting his voice like he was performing for an invisible jury. "You see this, boys?" Kincaid pointed at Mara, then at the pool of blood and her torn clothes. "This is the scene of a brutal crime. A washed-up, deranged drunk of a doctor kidnaps his friend's daughter. He drags her out into the wilderness, and when she resisted, he did unspeakable things." He paused, smirking in triumph, as he saw a flicker of disgust cross the faces of the younger soldiers. Kincaid was rewriting the script. He didn't need the ledger to kill Elias anymore. He would turn Elias into a monster, a rapist, and a murderer, making his execution look like justice in the eyes of the town. "That wound on her thigh," Kincaid continued, his voice hardening with accusation. "Look at that clumsy bandaging. He tortured her. He's an animal, and we are here to put him down." Elias heard every word. Every lie was a knife stabbing at his honor. But strangely, the rage inside him didn't explode. It settled, condensing into a block of cold ice. This was the moment he had to become Dr. Thorne again. Not the drunk, not the victim, but the man who commanded life and death in the operating theater. Elias laughed. The sound was raspy and dry, echoing through the tense air, causing everyone to freeze. Kincaid spun around, frowning. "What are you laughing at?" Elias slowly stood up, shaking off the hands of the two soldiers, holding him with a shrug that was slight but commanding. He stood there, caked in blood and dust, but his posture had shifted. His back was straight, his chin was high, the tremor in his hands was gone. "I'm laughing because you're a terrible quack, Harlan," Elias said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You're trying to diagnose a disease you don't understand." He took a step toward Kincaid. The two soldiers moved to intercept, but Kincaid raised a hand to stop them. He wanted to hear the Prey's last words. "You think you can fool anyone with that story?" Elias continued, his gaze drilling straight into Kincaid's pupils, analyzing, stripping him bare. "Look at my hands. This blood is from saving a life. But you, I can see the pulse in your neck jumping. You're scared, Harlan." "I ain't scared of a dying old man," Kincaid growled, his hand drifting to the holistic on his hip. "Yes, you are," Elias cut him off, his voice dropping to a razor-sharp whisper. "You're scared of that book. You're scared of the names inside it. Judge Miller, Senator Blackwood, the men who took your money. If that ledger gets out, you won't just lose your sheriff's badge. You'll be torn apart by your friends in Washington before the law even touches you." Kincaid drew. The black barrel of his revolver pointed straight at Elias's forehead, less than an arm's length away. "Tell me where the book is," Kincaid hissed, his trigger finger tightening, white with pressure, "or I'll blow your brains out right now." Silence fell over the canyon. Only the wind hissed through the cracks in the rock. Death was hovering right there, resting on Kincaid's fingertip. But Elias didn't blink. He looked straight down the barrel, then past it, into the eyes of the man holding the gun. He knew the psychology of greedy men. They feared losing everything more than they feared killing. "Shoot then," Elias challenged. "Pull the trigger, Harlan, and you will never find it. I am the only one who knows where it is. You kill me, your secret stays buried forever, until someone accidentally digs it up right around Election Day next year." Kincaid froze. Hesitation flickered in his eyes. He knew Elias was right. He couldn't risk it. Elias knew he had won the first move. Now for the checkmate. He glanced over at Mara. The girl began to moan softly, the pain pulling her out of the coma. "And one more thing," Elias said, his tone turning grave, carrying the weight of a terminal diagnosis. "The girl, she's dying." Kincaid raised an eyebrow. "So? She dies. That's one less loose end for me." "Mistake," Elias shook his head. "She is your countdown clock, Harlan. She has sepsis, high fever, rapid pulse. If she doesn't get emergency care, if that necrotic tissue isn't surgically cleaned within 6 hours, she's dead." Elias took another step, pressing his forehead against the muzzle of Kincaid's gun, forcing his enemy to take a step back from the sheer psychological pressure. "And here is my deal. The girl dies. You never find the book. I swear on the honor of a father who lost his child, if her heart stops beating, I take that secret to the grave. Torture me, skin me, burn me to ash. I won't say a damn word." Kincaid stared at Elias. He was calculating. He was a ruthless businessman, and this was a transaction. He needed the ledger. He needed Elias alive to extract the location. And if the old man was telling the truth, that the book's location depended on the girl's life, then he had to keep the second hostage breathing. "You're in a weak position, Elias," Kincaid snarled, though the gun lowered slightly. "You don't get to make demands." "I do," Elias retorted, steel in his voice. "Save her, and I talk. Take her to town. Put her in the clinic. Give her medicine, clean water, and a decent doctor. The moment I know she's safe, I'll lead you to the book." Kincaid was silent. For a long moment, he looked at Mara, gasping for air, then back at Elias. Hatred burned in his eyes, but logic won out. He holstered his gun. "Fine," Kincaid smirked, a poisonous grin. "I'll save the brat, but you're going to wish you died right here." He turned to his men. Tie the old man up. Tight. You two, make a stretcher, carry the girl back. Gentle now, she's valuable property. Two soldiers rushed Elias. They wrenched his arms behind his back, binding him with rough rope. This time, Elias didn't resist. He let them shove him around. His eyes never left Mara. He watched them lift her up. One soldier grabbed her leg roughly, right near the wound. Elias's heart seized. Don't touch it. Don't look too close. Luckily, the soldier only cared about moving her as fast as possible. He had no idea that beneath the bloody bandage under his hand lay the evidence that could end his boss's life. You made a hell of a mistake, Elias, Kincaid whispered in his ear as he walked past. You think you're buying time. You're just prolonging the pain. Elias was shoved, stumbling toward a horse. He raised his head, looking at the sky, turning the deep purple of twilight. Kincaid was wrong. Elias wasn't buying time for himself. He had bought life for the truth. As Mara was carried away, lying across a saddle a few yards ahead, Elias smiled faintly. It was a sad but satisfied smile. He was walking into hell on earth, Kincaid's jail where torture and death awaited. But he walked with the posture of a victor, because the bullet was already chambered, and the trigger was now in the hands of a mute girl who was being taken to the only place where it could be fired, the medical clinic. Let's go, Harlan, Elias said, his voice dripping with disdain as he was hoisted onto a horse. Don't keep the doctor waiting. The cavalcade began to move out of Devil's Canyon, leaving the dead silence behind. Darkness swallowed them, but within that darkness, a tiny spark had been lit, smoldering inside a girl's wound, waiting for the moment to erupt into a fire that would burn a criminal empire to the ground. Silver Creek at high noon was silent as a tomb, save for the rhythmic pounding of hammers. Harlan Kincaid didn't want to wait. He didn't want a trial. He wanted a show. In the middle of the dusty town square, a makeshift gallows had been hastily erected from pine timber that still smelled of fresh sap. Elias Thorne sat in the jail cell, his back against the cold stone wall. His face was a swollen, purple bruise. One eye was shut tight, puffed up to the size of an egg. Kincaid had kept his promise. He hadn't killed Elias immediately, but he had made him wish for death. Yet a faint smile played on Elias's cracked lips. It wasn't the smile of a madman, but the smile of a gambler playing his final hand, knowing his opponent had blinked. He listened to the hammers outside. Thud, thud, thud. Each strike was a second counting down. But he was listening for another sound, something fainter, coming from the direction of the medical clinic down the street. Silence. He wondered, did the doctor find it? Or did he simply toss that filthy bandage into the trash, along with my secret? At the medical clinic, Dr. Henry Sterling, a man of science, dry and cautious, stood over the operating table. He hated politics, he hated guns, and most of all, he hated cleaning up the messes made by drunken cowboys. He looked down at the young girl, lying in a feverish haze. High fever, rapid pulse. The infection was spreading. Animals, Sterling muttered, shaking his head in disgust as he examined Mara's crudely bandaged, filthy thigh. The man who did this doesn't deserve to be called human. He picked up his medical shears, the cold steel touching the fabric stiff with dried blood. Snip. The cloth gave way. The stench of old blood and burnt flesh rose up, pungent enough to make the nurse turn away. Sterling frowned. He saw the wound, a patch of blackened, charred flesh, looking like the mouth of a small, extinct volcano. He used gunpowder, he deduced, his voice dripping with professional disdain. A barbaric, medieval way to cauterize. He grabbed his forceps, intending to pull away the debris and clean the necrotic tissue, but as the tip of the forceps probed the center of the wound, it hit something hard. Clink. The sound of metal against metal. Sterling paused. He pressed the forceps down gently. It wasn't bone. It was smooth, cylindrical, and hard. What in the hell? Carefully, he pushed the instrument deeper, clamping onto the foreign object and pulling. Mara let out a pained whimper in her delirium, her body jerking. "Hold her down," Sterling ordered the nurse, his hands steady as he pulled. The object slid out of the slimy flesh. It landed on the enamel tray with a hollow clatter. A cartridge casing. A .45 caliber pistol shell coated in blood and pus. But the strange thing was the opening. It had been smashed flat, deliberately crimped shut. Dr. Sterling picked up the casing, wiping it on a white towel. He saw teeth marks on the brass rim, and he felt the weight of it. Far too light to hold powder. Curiosity overrode his disgust. He used the forceps to pry open the crimped mouth of the casing. There was no gunpowder inside, only a tiny roll of paper, wound incredibly tight. Sterling used tweezers to extract the paper. It was fragile, stained with a few spots of red, but the black India ink was still sharp. He spread it out on the instrument table. Sunlight from the window illuminated the page. Sterling's eyes scanned the lines. Expense, $2,000, Governor, to turn a blind eye to the Silver Mine Massacre. Income, sale of seized O'Neill land, buyer, railroad company. And at the bottom, the signature, the flamboyant, arrogant signature of Harlan Kincaid. The doctor's hands began to shake. He didn't care for politics, but he knew what this signature meant. This wasn't just paper. This was a death warrant for the most powerful man in the territory. And he understood why Elias Thorne had tortured the girl. He hadn't hurt her. He had turned her into a living safe. Sterling looked out the window. The gallows were finished. The crowd was gathering. Kincaid was standing there, adjusting his silk tie, looking triumphant. The doctor looked down at Mara, then at the paper. In that moment, the neutral man of science had to make a choice. Stay silent and live in peace, or speak up and likely lose his life. He stripped off his bloodied white coat, grabbed the paper, and bolted for the door. "Send a telegram," he shouted to the bewildered nurse. "Keep her alive. I have to get to the post office." Outside in the square, Elias was dragged from his cell. The harsh sunlight made him squint. With his hands bound behind his back, he limped between two rows of soldiers. The townspeople watched him with a mix of fear, contempt, and morbid curiosity. Kincaid stood on the wooden platform, looking down. "Elias Thorne," he proclaimed, his voice booming. "For the crimes of murder, kidnapping, and rape, I sentence you to death by hanging. Sentence to be carried out immediately. No defense. No judge, only Kincaid's law of the jungle." Elias was shoved up the stairs. The executioner pulled a black hood over his head, then slipped the rough noose around his neck. The rope chafed against his skin, itchy and cold. "Any last words, old man?" Kincaid leaned in close, whispering with mockery. "Where is the book? Tell me, and I'll make it quick." Elias took a deep breath. He smelled pine, dust, and the scent of approaching freedom. "I don't need last words, Harlan," Elias said, his voice strangely calm, coming from beneath the black hood. "I just wanted to say, you should check your mailbox." "What?" Kincaid frowned. Just then, a scream rang out from the edge of the square. "Stop! Stop it now!" The crowd parted. Dr. Sterling, drenched in sweat, was running forward, waving a freshly printed telegram in the air. Running right behind him was the elderly postmaster, holding a double-barreled shotgun pointed straight at the sky. Boom! The warning shot silenced the entire square. Kincaid flinched, his hand dropping to his holster. "Orders from the governor," Dr. Sterling screamed, breathless. He rushed to the foot of the gallows, holding the telegram up for all to see. "Emergency order from Santa Fe. All executions in Silver Creek are suspended. The U.S. Marshal is on his way." "What the hell are you talking about?" Kincaid roared, his face turning beet red. "I am the law here. This old man dies." "Not today, Harlan," Dr. Sterling retorted, the rage of an honest man finally boiling over. He threw the brass casing and the flattened paper evidence onto the wooden planks, right at Kincaid's feet. "This whole town needs to know what you did. I've already wired the contents of this paper. The whole world knows." Kincaid looked down at the casing. He recognized it. He looked at the unrolled paper. His eyes went wide, pupils contracting in terror. He looked at Elias, who was still standing there with a noose around his neck. Elias couldn't see anything through the hood, but he heard everything. He heard Kincaid's ragged breathing. He heard the murmurs of the crowd turning into angry shouts. And he smiled, a smile of pure relief. "I told you," he mumbled. "The doctor is always right." 2 weeks later, the Silver Creek jail was as cold as ever, but the air outside the window was unusually warm. Birds were singing, their melody mixing with the soft clink of chains. Elias Thorne sat on the hard wooden cot. He was still wearing the black and white striped prisoner uniform, but the swelling in his face had gone down, and he was clean-shaven. The heavy iron door opened with a screech. The U.S. Marshal, a massive man with a formidable mustache, stepped in. He didn't carry handcuffs. He carried a ring of keys. "Mr. Thorne," the Marshal said, his voice deep and steady, "Harlan Kincaid confessed. With the evidence in that shell casing, he and his entire ring of associates won't see the sun again." "And me?" Elias asked, without hope. "You kidnapped a girl. You disturbed the peace. You assaulted an officer, corrupt or not," the Marshal listed, then sighed. "The law is the law. You'll have to sit here for at least another 2 years." Elias nodded. 2 years. A cheap price to pay. "But," the officer smiled, stepping back, "I think there's someone who wants to see you before I lock the door." From behind the Marshal's back, a small figure stepped forward. Mara. She was limping, leaning on a wooden crutch, but she stood tall. She wore a clean new dress, her hair neatly brushed and tied back. She approached the bars. Her eyes, once filled with the terror of Devil's Canyon, were now clear and bright as the sky after a storm. She didn't speak. She still couldn't, but she didn't need to. Mara reached her small hand through the bars, grasping Elias's calloused hand. She squeezed it gently. Then she pulled something from her pocket. The brass cartridge casing. It had been cleaned and polished to a shine, strung on a leather cord to make a necklace. She placed it around her neck, then put her hand over her heart, looked at Elias, and smiled. It was the brightest smile Elias had seen since the day Sarah died. In that moment, the prison bars seemed to dissolve. Elias Thorne was no longer a prisoner. He was no longer a failed drunk. He was a father who had kept his promise. He reached up, gently touching Mara's fingers through the cold iron. "Live well, kid," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, but full of joy. "Don't look back. Just go. Walk toward the sun." Mara nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks, but the smile remained. She turned and limped out of the dark corridor, heading toward the frame of brilliant sunlight waiting outside. Elias stood there, hands gripping the bars, watching that small silhouette until it merged with the light. He sat back down on the cot, leaned his head against the wall, and for the first time in 10 years, he closed his eyes and drifted into sleep, without a single drop of liquor. He had saved her. And in a way, she had saved him.